Okay. I guess the ball's in my court. Thanks. Thanks, Purdy. Thanks for having me here. Nice to see you all. Always great to speak with founders in this stage of their journey. That's kind of my sweet spot and my happy place. And maybe I'll just kind of start by saying I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs over the past decade. And, as they're kind of growing their companies and they're going into the next stages of growth, I always try to remind them to enjoy this time because when I look back at the 5 or 6 different companies that I built, in hindsight, this was always the exciting time when you're working with a small team, you're working with your mates, you're problem solving, you're trying to go really, really quickly. And to me, that's where so much of the magic happens. Once you raise more capital and the company grows, you become less of a founder and more of a manager. So I know you're all excited to get to that next stage of your company, but really try to appreciate the moment that you're in because this is really the magic time, in my opinion. So, with that being said, I guess I'm supposed to talk about myself, which is probably my least favorite topic. And I have a pretty strange and convoluted startup kind of entrepreneurial journey. So I'll try to go through it as quickly as I can. I mean, I guess I've been an entrepreneur my whole life, even before I even knew that term. Even as a kid, I was always kind of hustling and creating little ventures and finding ways to make money. And my dad worked for a really big company, Esso, Exxon, at the time, the largest company in the world. So one thing I knew for sure is I didn't want to do that. And I knew I wanted to be able to forge my own path. So that's kind of what I did. I actually built my first company in grad school. So I studied international development in grad school, which sounds very, very different from the capitalistic entrepreneurial approach. But I did that because of various passions. And in the process of grad school, I started a consulting firm and got really lucky because I got great contracts right off the bat, started growing the company. And within just about 2 years, I ended up getting acquired by a bigger firm, became a partner in that firm, and then spent 8 years doing that work. And it was pretty extraordinary. I was in my 20s, early 30s, traveling all over the world to pretty exotic, remote destinations and doing meaningful work, really focused on poverty, which I loved. I worked everywhere from the West Bank of Palestine to Liberia to the northern Philippines to Aboriginal communities in Canada, and love that work. But like many other entrepreneurs, probably like some of you in this room, I stumbled upon a problem that I thought could be solved with technology. And after a bunch of humming and hawing and about 6 months of kind of due diligence and exploration, I decided to sell my share in the consulting company and build my first technology company. That was in 2009, 2010, which, to be fair, is probably the worst time, at least in my lifetime, to try to start a business. We were like knee deep in a recession, and certainly wasn't easy to raise capital. And then I compounded the mistake by deciding to take on a business partner in Germany. So I moved from Vancouver, Canada, to Munich, Germany, to start this company. And the trajectory was fast, just like a lot of early stage startups. We were learning and moving really quickly, and then it came time to get some money. I had invested everything I had into this business, and I needed to raise capital. And the deals that we got offered were terrible, to put it bluntly. Liquidation preferences, 2, 3x, terrible valuations, unsophisticated investors. Such was, I think, the climate in Germany at the time. It wasn't a very sophisticated startup ecosystem then. So after much deliberation, decided to move the company to the US, to Colorado, where I'm originally from. And fortunately, we were able to raise money pretty quickly, start to grow it. And so I built a company called Kula.com. It was an enterprise marketing tech SaaS company with a social venture component in it. In the end, we raised about $6 million, and to my dismay, in hindsight particularly, it worked. So with all of the mistakes that I made, and I think at least I feel like I made all of them and barely managed to recover every time, the company grew, and we ended up signing huge clients. Our first one was JetBlue Airlines. We signed Kellogg, the big food company. Coca-Cola was one of our biggest clients. Walmart, number of hotels, restaurant chains, travel companies. And yeah, the company grew and it worked. But in the process, I would say it took a toll on me. So I used to be a professional athlete. I was a professional whitewater kayaker all through college, grad school. And so I was pretty healthy and pretty fit. And that startup journey, I don't know if I can curse on here, so sorry in advance for your recording, but it really kicked my ass. And I ended up gaining about 15 kilos. I started smoking cigarettes, which I still in hindsight, I can't believe. But I was living pretty much 200 days a year out of a suitcase, out of hotels, traveling all over the place. This was pre-Zoom business meetings. So I was flying all over the world to do this stuff. And the more capital we raised, the bigger the team got, the more kind of stress that I took on myself. And 3.5 years into it, I kind of reached close to burnout phase. And I was pretty unhappy. I was building my dream, doing everything that I always wanted to, but I was pretty stressed out and pretty unhappy with the journey. So I made the decision that I wanted to step out. That wasn't an easy decision. This is the summary of that story, but I ended up making that decision, spoke with my board, and decided to resign. And fortunately, company was going well. The investors were deeply committed, and I ended up getting an exit, which was quite beneficial because then I packed up my life, moved into the mountains, and decided I wanted to reclaim my health and well-being, which I did for about a year and a half. But the entrepreneurial itch never goes away. So, I built a pretty fast failing app at that time, started doing my first angel investments, and then had some interesting opportunities. I was always looking for ways to merge both facets of my career, the kind of development, community driven side and the entrepreneurial side. So I started getting into the ecosystem side of things. I went to Switzerland, helped a university there build up their kind of startup programming. Then I got brought on to a university in the US to build a 10,000 square foot innovation center, startup accelerator, incubator. Did that. In that process, I was in this deep reflective process during that time, and like, what were the mistakes that I made on my first journey? What did I learn? What could I have done better? And a number of things came to the forefront. One of them, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more today, was product. And I learned on that journey as a non-technical person how crappy I was at not just, obviously I couldn't code, I couldn't build, but even managing product teams and managing technical teams really effectively. And while I was working with a whole bunch of founders during that time, I saw that problem existed in a number of different ways. And I kind of accidentally built a software company. I ended up meeting a group of folks in Eastern Europe and was shuttling my startups access to dev resources, and ended up developing a process of product development kind of based around the tenets of design-driven development. That company just kind of accidentally grew, ended up being about 35 employees, and I sold it 4 years later. Totally no real vision or plan behind that. It just kind of happened the way that it did. Once I did that, I really wanted to focus on my topic of well-being. So I made a strange decision in my 40s to move to Germany and do a PhD, which I did 4 or 5 years ago on the topic of entrepreneurial well-being and peak performance. When I did that, I stumbled back into the German startup ecosystem, which looked totally different than it did a decade prior. A lot had happened, a lot had evolved and changed. And I've been in Germany ever since. So since then, I've kind of done a lot of fractional CEO, founder as a service type work. I helped build a corporate venture studio for a UK fund here in Germany. I built a longevity clinic for a fund in Switzerland. And then, let's see, I also built a a building materials marketplace for a big company, big international company called Cemex, and built that in the US. And then since then, I've just kind of really been focusing on angel investing and supporting other founders and doing things like I'm doing here today. So I was kind of going through it the other day. I think I've worked with close to 1,000 startups in various kind of mentorship capacities, helped them raise about 150 million bucks over that time. I'm a CEO coach for Alchemist Accelerator, an all-star mentor for Techstars. That's how I met Purdy. A number of other programs as well. And now, I guess you could say you're always between ventures. So there's probably a couple more left in my life cycle, but mostly I invest, help other startups, and work with my business partner, CTO Ruse Bay, on playing with new concepts. Sorry for the long-winded.
It was quite the intro. And like your life is, I can't believe how much life you've managed to fit into your life so far. It's all very impressive. And there's so many questions. If people have any specific questions, then feel free to pop them in the chat. We're just going to have maybe 15-20 minutes of conversation, then we'll open it up to Q&A anyway. And I know there's so much to cover with your experience. Like we just mentioned, this week is kind of about product, but we're going to talk a little bit about product, a little bit about fundraising, a little bit about go-to-market. And I imagine the cohort will be interested in some of the deals that you managed to get over the line with big kind of enterprise clients, and how you managed to win over Coca-Cola and those kinds of big brands, because that makes such a massive difference to your pitch deck and how investors will view the business. So even though we didn't mention that before, if you're happy to, we'll start with that. Like, what was I guess, how did you start building those relationships? How did you get your foot into the door with some of those bigger companies? And then how did you get them to trust you as a startup and start using your services?
Wow. I mean, I could spend a whole hour or more on that topic. So how do I summarize it? I mean, first of all, there's a huge, when you're in the enterprise world, a lot of the tenets that you learn around lean startup, I think, fall apart a little bit because you don't necessarily have this opportunity to create a lot of failures and make mistakes. Because especially with a SaaS, once you're integrating with a big corporate client, you have SLAs, you have expectations that need to be met. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, that goes into that as well. But I mean, how do you even get to the table and get those deals in the first place is, I mean, it's something that maybe I have a bit of a playbook now, but I learned from trial and error. And fortunately, I had a few mentors that were able to help me along the way. I mean, the first is how do you get your foot in the door, and how do you even find the right decision makers? And I think big mistakes were made by us that really slowed down our sales cycles. And, we tried to navigate through organizations to find the right decision makers, and we found that didn't work very effectively, particularly because we had touch points with marketing, finance, and tech. So we essentially had to target multiple business units with our value proposition or variations of our value proposition, which made it very, very difficult to, work your way up through the hierarchy to get to those right decision makers. We actually had a sign up in the Kula office that said it takes 12 people to say yes, but only one person to say no. Because we would get yeses and yeses and yeses, but from marketing and from finance. And then, we would get to the tech decision maker and they'd be like, no chance, doesn't fit on our roadmap, too complex, whatever it might be. So we really, after kind of 22 months of trial and error, we really had to shift our mindset. And, because we were enterprise, because we were a young startup, and because we were dealing with literally Fortune 100s, we had to kind of shift our strategy altogether. And I would say, fortunately, I found this incredible PR firm that really knew our industry well. And at some point, they almost acted as a lead gen and qualification organization for us as well, because they had so many contacts of C-suites. So we took a strategy of thought leadership, and we kind of focused our attention on, we were selling something that people didn't know that they actually wanted yet. And so we had this, our funnel looked a little bit different. We had to, kind of identify, educate, advocate, qualify, convert. So we had this a lot of heavy lifting at the top of the funnel. And so how could we kind of hack that process? Well, we took the approach of we want to be thought leaders in this space. So instead of, you know, communicating our offer, we tried to take ownership of the problem. So there were a number of different problems: liability management in these loyalty programs where they had liabilities on their balance sheets, a lack of engagement, a lack of customer data. So we tried to focus on, hey, here's a really big problem that maybe you're not thinking of. We're going to be the go-to people when you do. So that's hence the reason I was living out of a suitcase so much. I was speaking at conferences constantly. I was really, doing media requests and always trying to put our brand and myself secondarily as the kind of central owner of this problem. So whether these big companies had identified it now or not, eventually they probably would, and there will be this recollection of this startup that's addressing that problem. That ended up kind of triggering the first opportunity for our first client, which was JetBlue Airways, and then a series of spectacular events happened. So we were in integration. Keep in mind, these companies have, this old legacy technologies, so integrations were not super easy. It wasn't just about connecting APIs. So we're spending months working with JetBlue on this initiative, and an act of God essentially happened. So Hurricane Sandy hit New York, or it was the day before it was about to hit New York. And since we were in cause marketing, JetBlue called me and said, hey, this is happening. I know we're not ready yet. We want to run a campaign around this hurricane that looks like is going to devastate New York. My CTO said, no way, there's no chance that we can do this. So my head of product and myself and our head of marketing got together, and we decided to hack together a WordPress page and pretty much fake it on the back end, and did that overnight. And at 7 a.m. Eastern time, we contacted JetBlue and said, hey, we have something, you can push it out right now. We think it's going to work. And they decided to take that chance. It was important to them. They're called New York's hometown airline for a reason. So they put this thing out, and it immediately started working really well. We raised $700,000 through that campaign in about 36 hours. And it was a big deal. In the end, Barack Obama ended up handing over a really big check. It got us a ton of media, a ton of press, and that really led to inbound conversions at that point. So that's when Coca-Cola and Kellogg started reaching out to us. So our kind of whole hypothesis that, these big corporates are risk averse and they're almost like lemmings. If you can close one, the other ones are more likely to follow. That ended up working. And just to bring it all back to product, I guess, is what we learned in that experience was our core offering and the slick shininess of our product didn't really matter as much. If we had a chance to just hack something together and get some early results, that's what kind of triggered the success of Kula.
Yeah, I guess prior to the act of God, which could kind of start this whole chain reaction with the other brands, how were you measuring whether what you were doing was successful or not? We actually had someone else speak to this the other day, someone from Alibaba, who also used thought leadership as a way to build trust with a new market that didn't quite understand what the product offering was. And she said it's quite difficult to measure whether your thought leadership is effective or not. Was there anything that you were actually looking at in terms of KPIs or touch points?
I mean, yeah, I would say that came later in the process from a product standpoint. In the early days, before we really got to market, because we needed a big enterprise to get to market, we just focused on the problem, right? So our initial idea of what Kula was going to be and what it ended up becoming was profoundly different. And the reason was, we had hypotheses of what the problem was that these companies were facing. And I think the hypotheses were proven to be correct. The problem was they didn't recognize how big the pain point was. So we needed to find an entry point that seemed urgent to them, that the pain point was urgent enough that they were willing to take essentially a big risk and put in the opportunity cost of dealing with a startup that has the potential to not be around in a couple years. So I would say our kind of framework for analysis was really our funnel at that point, and really understanding, like, were we even getting meetings? Were we able to, test our problem hypotheses and get the right responses that we need?
Mhm.
And were we getting follow-ups? Did we get from first touch to actually doing a presentation to actually doing a demo and to start, negotiating where to go from there? Before JetBlue signed, we had a lot. I mean, at one point I flew to Fort Worth, Texas 6 times to talk with Southwest Airlines, thinking that that would have been our first client. And I just ended up kind of in the hamster wheel, hoping that would happen. And it never did in the end. But for us at that stage, it was really about the funnel and really understanding, can we meet those companies and meet those individuals where they are, and identify a pain point that we knew that we could solve. In terms of the product roadmap, that started to unfold a little more when we got traction. So we were always building, but we were really trying to build from the inside out, right? So we were trying to, the end value proposition, the user experience, and the way it kind of connected with those other technologies weren't really defined until we knew exactly what component of our offering we were able to do. I mean, the long story short here is, like, whether you're a consumer company or you're an enterprise company, you still have to be super focused on solving a problem with a real pain point and learning from the customers as quickly as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. How does that tie in with the fundraise in terms of the timeline of how things were happening? Did you have some traction, or within your kind of pipeline that you were talking about, of how many initial conversations you were having and how they were progressing? Did you use that as part of the narrative when you were speaking to investors, or had you already closed some deals by the time you were speaking with investors?
No, we raised some pre-seed money kind of off of vision and team, and I think we were fortunate that I think my background and my previous work showed some connection to the problem and a decent understanding of why big companies aren't kind of participating in these types of initiatives, and that bought us our first 500K, but that really was it. So, the next kind of tranche of funding that we raised, it wasn't the kind of bigger round yet. So we did have to show, I wouldn't say we showed proof of concept, but what we sold was momentum, right? That we were moving in that direction. And I think that's really something to think about as well, especially for pre-revenue companies. Like, you may not have really clear KPIs or clear measures that you can point to that investors care about, which might be the number of customers or the amount of revenue or whatnot. So what we really tried to sell was delta, right? When you met us, we were here, and now we're here. So how fast are you moving? How fast are you learning? How fast are you confirming or debunking the hypotheses you have? And then how can you do all the other things that founders need to be able to do? Can you tell a good story, whether it's to potential customers, to investors, or in terms of recruiting? Can you identify and hire top talent? So we raised a pretty good, I think we raised about a little over $1 million, 1.1 million before we ever got our first customer and our first revenue, essentially. So I think, we like to think so much about, like, these very, very clear markers, but I think there's something to think about. And to me, there's a point in every business where the narrative changes and the story changes. And in the early days, you're focused on selling a story. You're aspirational, right? So you're painting a picture of this amazing future that you were going to foster and catalyze. And at some point, your company becomes more tractional, right? And it becomes more about, what are these clear growth metrics, like kind of very rational numbers that you can point to. There's a great advantage to staying in the inspirational side as long as you possibly can, because you're allowing an investor or a potential employee to kind of use their imagination and imagine the possibilities. So in these early days, look, if you have numbers and they look good, great. If not, the core mission is about how do you tell a compelling story, meet people where they are, and get them to envision what is possible with what you're building. I think in hindsight, that was something we were really, really good at. And because we were enterprise and because we were doing something different, we had really long sales cycles at the beginning. So we were forced to kind of double down on big grand vision, kind of doing the things that were within our locus of control until we got more hard numbers that we could kind of shift towards and start to change the narrative.
Yeah. Did you ever have the exit in mind when you were right in the early stages? Because it sounds like some of the exits that you've had kind of came about during the process, but were you intentional when you were speaking, maybe not telling investors what the exit plans were, but did you have that in your mind?
Oh, definitely. I definitely had it in my mind, but I rarely ever talked about it. I really tried to focus on selling an impact story. So we had this big metric that we wanted to increase corporate giving and corporate philanthropy by $1 billion. And that was what I kind of formed the story around. Of course, everyone understood that we would take 10% out of that, and the company could be really successful that way. I was asked sometimes like what the exit strategy was, and I mean my answer was always the same back then, and surprisingly, it's probably what I would tell founders now is that yes, this is where we see a potential exit being, or who could be a potential acquisition. And this is the size of the market and what we think we can potentially reach within that market. But we're solely focused, our myopic focus is on creating this amazing experience for our customers. And if we do that right, then there'll probably be even more opportunities. So I think it's important to always know your numbers and always have hypotheses about your strategy. But I think you have to be very careful at deliberately trying to sell your exit strategy in such early days, because you either come off as naive or just solely focused on, this very rational return, which, that type of extrinsic motivation is great, but it may not be something that gets you through the highs and lows of the journey.
Yeah, that makes sense. So removing your founder hat and putting your investor hat on, if a founder is pitching you, so for a bit of context, the founders in this cohort are kind of post pre-seed, so they've raised a little bit of maybe friends and family or angel money, and they're going on to a larger raise now, so they're kind of in between. So spending the money that they have raised in the most efficient way possible to get the best results, to optimize, for the next raise. What would be the dream pitch that you could get, which is a very broad question, from a founder? Like, what is just green flag after green flag after green flag?
From a pitch standpoint or from the actual investment opportunity standpoint?
Yeah, investment opportunity, but it could be the narrative or the way that it's communicated as well.
Gotcha. So one of my mentors, I guess you could say, Purdy, maybe David Brown, who founded Techstars, like he said something to me once that really, really hit home. And he said his top 3 investment criteria are team, team, and team. Mm-hmm. And I love that. And then I think after that is like market size and USP, something along those lines. But, team is first and foremost. So you got to have the right people in place. Ideally, you have a founder market fit. That means you felt the pain of the problem that you're solving. You're not just an idea generator, but you're someone that really understands the customer. And if you don't understand the customer, you are so damn focused on learning about that and trying to take this empathic approach to understanding the customer that you prove yourself to belong in this problem-solving context. I think that's probably the most important thing. Of course, then what? What does execution look like? And when you look at a founder team and you look at an early stage venture, I like to say there's only two roles in a startup. You either build shit or you sell shit. So if you're an engineer or a scientist, like, you know your job, build, and do it really well. If you are not the technical person, you've got to sell. You are the chief storyteller, right? And so I think a lot of a pitch of an early stage startup particularly is, one is the content of the pitch, of course, but to me something I look for is the delivery of the pitch, right? Like, are you a master storyteller? Do you get up in front of an investor or a client or a potential customer and do a McKinsey pitch, right? Are you walking through 50 slides, walking through so many details and projections, and it's very much one-way communication? That tends to not work very well. It certainly doesn't work if you're pitching it to me. What I always like to think of is, you're an elder in a village, or you're a grandparent on the holidays, and you got all the kids around, and you're telling a story. You're telling a fairy tale. You're painting this exciting, beautiful picture. There's a protagonist and an antagonist of the story. It's the hero's journey that you're selling. And you can do that in the context of an investor pitch or a customer pitch or even a pitch to potential employees. In the end, it's about having empathy. It's about meeting people where they are, and it's about connecting human to human. I think so often we're taught that the primary unit of analysis of a successful startup is the firm. I'm a big believer that we need to look at the individual. You connect with the person who's across the table from you, whoever you're presenting to, and you're going to have a much greater likelihood of success. Now, how do you do that? Just to talk about the pitch really quickly. First of all, keep it simple. It's amazing to me how, especially first-time founders and less experienced founders just want to blab everything they know and throw everything they can into a pitch. I like to think of a pitching to an investor as kind of like a funnel, right? And oftentimes it works that way. If you're going to a VC fund, you may start with an associate, and then you go to a principal and go a little deeper diligence, and then you go to a partner, and then it goes to the investment committee. So the idea is like increasing complexity as needed. So keep it short and simple at the beginning, leave very little room for criticism, because keep in mind, your audience is often looking for something to identify why an investment shouldn't be made. Slowly start, get them into the process, get them bought in more and more, increase their opportunity cost in the deal, and you're going to have a greater likelihood of success. So keep it simple, less is more. Focus on the problem. I can't count how many founders I see that are a solution looking for a problem rather than a problem looking for a solution. You can have the coolest tech, the greatest team in the world, but if you can't show that you have a really clear problem and a clear pain point and know someone that actually feels that pain point, you're going to have a hard time reaching anybody. And then I'll say the last thing. Do your research, know who you're talking to. I think at one point in our second round of fundraising, I had about 25 different pitch decks so we segmented all of the investors that we wanted to talk to into different categories. We did deep dive research. And I mean, we were creeping people on Facebook to understand what their hobbies were and whether they had kids, and looked at their other portfolios and investments and see if there were synergies there. Like, anything we could learn about that investor, we tried to incorporate into the story that we were trying to tell. So, it's the classic analogy: 80% research, 20% execution. Know who you're talking to, and then find ways to connect with them. Like, I teach a course and run a workshop on the neuroscience of startup pitches, and really kind of understanding how you structure a pitch to kind of affect people emotionally and tap into their neurochemistry most effectively. Quick example of that. I see a lot of teams start with their solution. Here's this great thing we're doing. And then 3, 4, 5 slides in, they'll say, oh yeah, here's the problem that we're solving. What does that do? It triggers dopamine first, and then you get to the problem, and it triggers cortisol. You're doing it backwards, right? What kind of feelings do you want to leave with that audience? You want to leave them feeling positive. You want to have that dopamine boost. You want to tell a story so it triggers oxytocin, which drives generosity and connection. So the more you think about pitching to an investor not as a presentation of what we do, but a story, you're going to find ways to connect with them more emotionally, to use biology to your advantage and increase your probability of success.
I love that. Is there any, I'm going to move to Q&A because we're running out of time, and I know we had a ton more questions, but I want to make sure that the founders get an opportunity to ask you their questions as well. And you've kind of mentioned some how-tos, but are there any red flags outside of someone putting the solution before the problem that would just turn you off when you're getting pitched to?
Red flags. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem piece is the one that I see the most, right? And it's not so much putting the solution before the problem. It's also just not knowing what the problem is. I also think a big red flag is people that get, or founders that get too attached to their idea, you know? And I think Purdy, you probably know this too from having mentored and coached a lot of founders. Like I think one thing you can identify really quickly in that experience is which ones are open to learning and which ones are just so attached to their idea that they don't have that flexibility and movability in that experience. So, it's a challenging thing being a founder because we have this like, this energy called the ego that's behind us. And there are times you want to turn it on and it can be super, super powerful. And then there are times you need to throttle it back and come in with a great deal of humility. And that often involves kind of a detachment from your initial concept or the idea that you're selling and being open to learning and open to change. So it does come back to this adage that I believe is that, investors don't invest in companies, they invest in people. And really understanding how well people are going to navigate complexity and uncertainty and have that ability to learn, to grow, to change, to inspire and motivate. I think that is, if you don't have that and you're not kind of presenting those characteristics, the trust hurdle of an investor or even a customer working with you is increasingly higher.
Yeah. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, hands raised already. Okay. I'll just take one from the chat and then we'll get to the people with the hands raised. So question from Jolie. On thought leadership, if the co-founder is a renowned scientist in the area, can we leverage on previous research and articles?
Oh, hell yeah. That sounds like a dream, actually. I would, that's the kind of stuff you want to build thought leadership around, right? Because that's, if you've had someone doing empirical, and peer-reviewed research around a particular subject, and they have deep domain expertise, that is the secret sauce that I think a lot of investors want to see. If you look at the profiles, I don't know if you guys have ever studied the research of what successful entrepreneurs look like. I think the popular culture says it's some 25-year-old kid in a hoodie hacking away in a basement. It's not actually the case. It's the 45-year-old, career business person that has deep domain expertise and stumbled upon a problem that wasn't being solved very effectively. So if you have domain expertise, that is exactly what you want to build thought leadership around. And you almost make that central to what your offer is. And then, of course, you have all of the great commercial minds and perhaps technical minds behind it that are taking science and innovation and finding ways to translate that into commercializable action, which is no small feat within itself. But short answer, yes, you have domain expertise. That's exactly what you want to build your thought leadership around.
Thank you. Darren.
Thanks, Purdy. Gerrit, that just phenomenal. What a wonderful, fantastic history you have. It's brilliant. My question is, clearly you've got a lot of experience and had really good teams around you as you've built, various businesses. Has there come a point whereby you've had to let someone go within the management team, and how did you go about that?
Oh shit, you are triggering some PTSD in me, mate. Yeah, more times than I would like. I would say it's the worst part of this career path, without question. You get all the glory and you get all the suffering when you're putting yourself in a role like this. the example that just always comes to mind is, when I moved Kula back from Germany to the US, I was looking, I had some momentum, but I no longer really had a team. And I was looking for some support, and I ended up bringing in my best friend, who is a career entrepreneur and business person. And because of certain life circumstances, he just was not performing very well. And it came to a point where, after discussions with investors and whatnot, I was getting pressured to terminate him. This has been my best friend of 20 years. Like, he's like a brother to me. It was the worst experience, I think, professionally, that I ever had to go through in my life. I was meeting with one of my investments last week. I was up in Copenhagen, and they're in a similar position. And they were asking how to deal with it, and they had this whole idea that they were going to bring the founder team together, and there was going to be this very kind of loving conversation. Again, one of them was an old friend of one of the founders. And, I basically advised them that you have to do those things within the context of the social fabric of those relationships, right? So I actually advised them, like, have his friend take him aside and have this kind of heart-to-heart kind of conversation, and create an environment where he can save face and he can, do this with grace and elegance. That's different in other contexts where you've hired someone and you realize that they're not a good fit and you have to let them go. And especially in places like here in Germany, there's pretty strict HR guidelines in which you want to adhere to, and you want to kind of handle everything above board. But I'm a big believer in servant leadership and kind of heart-centered approaches to leading businesses. So, I just think transparency and openness and emotion works the best. I know that comes in conflict with certain cultures in certain parts of the world, but good communication, good dialogue, and honestly, if you do all of that stuff really well earlier on in the process, maybe you can avoid needing to terminate someone in the first place. But the one last thing I'll say about that is, every time I've had to terminate someone after that first really horrific experience for me, we didn't talk for a year and a half. We're good now, but it was a rough go. Is when I do have to let someone go, I always try to look inward before looking outward. I think we as founders get so focused on all of the different things we have to do that we just say, okay, that person isn't performing, they've got to go. I really try to look inward and say, okay, what was the reason they weren't performing? What could I have done better? What did I not do good enough? What did the company not do good enough that did not put that person in a position to succeed? Because if you just terminate people when they're not performing, the chances of that process repeating is pretty high. So what can you learn from that experience, and how can you make yourself and the organization better?
Thank you. Noel.
Hi, Gerrit. Really enjoyed your presentation. I've just a question on your use of PR. We are a B2B SaaS startup, pre-revenue, and in fact, we are meeting ExxonMobil, the company your dad worked for, this Wednesday. It took us a while to really find the right person to speak with, but we have been engaged with other enterprise companies, and we have found the right person. And the problem sometimes they don't know they have, even though, and we found their exact user. How do you dig deeper to get them to engage? Because they don't know that is an issue. They are the right person, but sometimes they're so busy, they're so stretched, and it's trying to get them to engage to give you that, the clarity matrix that we want. And that's my first question. The second question is that what made you choose a PR company as a startup? Because obviously it's a luxury item, and would be interested in knowing who that PR company is, and how did that help you fundraise? Because you mentioned a little bit about, we got a group of people to invest. Was that angel or crowdfunding? If you could just, I know I have 3 questions there. If you could, Yep. If you have time to answer them. Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, the first question I think is really useful, especially for enterprise companies, right? Is, you're trying to learn the nuances of the problem that they face, the pains they face, how they prioritize it, how valuable it is to them. And that's really hard to do. Information is an asset, and it's not always easy to get that information out. In the same vein, you can have, you could be talking to ExxonMobil and you could be talking to Shell or BP that are all very similar companies, but they're structured completely different. They're facing different pain points and different struggles. So oftentimes you're trying to gather information from one and see what you can kind of learn that would be applicable to others. For for SaaS companies, especially for enterprise, like honestly, I'm a really big believer in unpaid pilots. And I know that goes against what a lot of investors would like to see. Why isn't a paid pilot? They should have skin in the game. Totally agree with that. But there is a benefit to doing a low paid or an unpaid pilot, especially if you structure it right, and you have a clear statement of work and TOR with it. And in that case, you're exchanging cost for knowledge, right? We're not going to charge you, or we're going to charge you a nominal fee for this. In exchange, we want to have weekly meetings. We want to get regular feedback. We want to learn about your priorities. We want you to help us quantify the value of our technology on your company. That gets you closer to value-based pricing. And, the more you can learn, the more valuable it is. So the big question is, in the stage of your development and your growth, what's more important, the meager revenue you're getting in an early stage or the really fast learnings? And I think that's a trade-off that you have to make.
Okay.
From a PR standpoint, it just made sense for us. Like, it was a steep cost, but we negotiated in such a way that we started small and we incrementally increased that cost. Granted, it was 10 years ago, but I think we started at like $3,000 a month. Eventually we were up to about 10 grand a month. But if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, that's like one employee, right? And we found that in that case, we got multiple employees with multiple skill sets in a fractional capacity. So in that PR firm, we had the Rolodex of all the CEOs and CMOs of these big companies. We had content creators, we had marketeers, and we didn't have to hire those people in-house. So I think rationally, it made sense. Of course, I had to sell that to my board, but once they understood how deeply entrenched that firm was in our industry, it became a pretty easy sell. That firm's called Think Inc. PR. They really specialized in travel, tourism, and hospitality. So they were just perfect for us because they knew our customer. Frankly, they knew our customer better than we did. And I would go to conferences, and the CEO of that company would basically go around looking for C-levels of these big companies and then come grab me and make introductions. So they were almost like a salesperson as well. So if you have the right organization and you have the right context, it can be extremely effective. On the flip side, that was an extreme case. If you are selling a solution to a problem that most people don't know they have, what is the way to really kind of get that problem front and center? Well, it's going to the trade shows, it's going to the very specific conferences where those leaders go, and you're the one on stage talking about that problem. You're the one that is owning that challenge. So they're identifying that problem with you. That's a very, very hard to do as a startup on its own without those contacts. It's just slow. I'm a big believer, the biggest metric, the most important metric for all of you guys is speed. So the faster you can get to where you need to go, that's probably a good thing to invest in.
Thank you.
Thanks. We've got 8 minutes and quite a lot of questions today, so we'll get through as many as we can.
I'll be shorter. Sorry.
Rob.
Hey, hi Gerrit. Thank you for that. Really enjoyed the session. I'll try and be quick. So your passion for founder and entrepreneurial wellness really comes through this conversation, obviously from your personal experience and then from your studying. Have you got any tips that you could share with us, guys? You've obviously got 50 founders on here at different levels, different stages. Not necessarily, the priority isn't always our own wellness. So sometimes we need a bit of guidance and support as to what to focus on. Yeah,
good question, mate. I'll try to do that without being cliches. Because the cliches are many here. I mean, look, it is a marathon, not a sprint. You have to take care of yourself on this journey because your energy is one of the key inputs into an organization. How do you do that? I mean, we can talk for hours. Sorry, could somebody mute? I'm hearing myself while I speak. Thanks.
Rob, I did mute you because I think it's coming across. So if you can just mute yourself whilst he's talking, and then you can unmute if you want to respond.
Cool. Thanks. So, I mean, there's so many different interventions, so many things I could talk about, but I use the analogy of building a house, and just to give you a high level framework. So, you know, the foundation of the house is the most important, which is your motivations, right? So it's super important that you know your why, you know your motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Why are you doing this? Because you're making a whole shitload of trade-offs to become a founder, right? Stability, good paycheck, all that stuff you're paying for. Having that foundation in place is going to provide a great framework of analysis and a great place to kind of check back on periodically to make sure you're going where you want to go. Then think of the walls of the house. That's your goals, right? And like, that's not just the goals of the company, but that's your individual goals and actions in the short term to your long-term goals, lifelong goals. What story are you telling on your deathbed, right? Like, really keeping that goal stack in place is fundamental, because it's constantly changing and evolving, and you want to make sure you have that in place because that helps you make good decisions. On top of that, you've got, when you start thinking of the roof of the house, you've got your kind of different components of well-being, right? Physical health, emotional health, relationship health, all of these things matter, and understanding that there are trade-offs taking place. And then on top of that, you have all the different hacks and interventions and tools that you can do. The one message that I would say at that top level that I found to be the most profound is the way you manage your time, right? And I think it's Parkinson's law says you will allocate the amount of energy and time into work as you provide for it, something along those lines. And I think all of us know that if you're doing this, the chance of becoming a workaholic is extremely, extremely high. So I actually have flipped the script, and I prioritize the most important time to me, which is for my health and for family and relationships. And I create a walled garden around that. And then I let work fill in all of the other stuff. So I count for sleep, I count for exercise, and I count for my family and friends, and then work fills in the rest. If you do it the other way and you create blocks for work and then try to fill in all the other stuff, guess what? You're going to be missing things in your life, and you're going to get all out of whack.
Really useful. Thank you so much. Tom.
Gerrit. Just a question in terms of your approach to fundraising. You mentioned you did quite a lot of deep research, almost like stalking level of your potential investors. How many investors did you have in that database? What sort of numbers do you think we should be aiming for? I know it's a difficult question, but any advice on that could be great, because our options now are so much higher, so many more investors than when you were originally fundraising.
Yeah. I would say you have a bigger pool to pull from, but that also adds more complexity. I think I pitched to 80 investors before I got my first check, something along those lines. But I was also spraying and praying, because it was my first time as a tech entrepreneur. I didn't have those networks in place. Later down in my journey, it became much easier. I had a big network. I could really identify who the players were, and I had some reputation and gravitas to get me those intros. What I would say in short is, if you have a big pool of potential investors, treat it like you would customers, right? Treat it like a customer discovery, right? What are the hypotheses that you have? Create a big funnel, identify your hypotheses, test at the kind of top of the funnel with the least important investors, do some pitches, see what you can learn from that, try to segment them as best you can. Do they invest at the right stage? Do they provide value beyond a check? Are you a good fit into their portfolio? And then start by practicing your pitch with the ones that maybe don't fit as well. So you save the high leverage ones for when you're on your A game, because if all of you have raised money before, your day one pitches looked a hell of a lot different than your day 60 pitches, right? So I would say treat it like you were doing customer discovery. And the more you can segment, and the more you can kind of bucket them and test from different buckets and test your hypotheses, you're eventually going to get to an ideal investor profile. And then that'll limit things down a bit. And then you work your way from bottom to top till you get to the ones that you really want.
Just one follow-up question, if I may, in terms of keeping, you obviously everyone's probably reporting to their existing investors. in terms of the ones that you've maybe spoken with once or twice, what's your advice for sort of keeping those potential investors updated, striking that balance of keeping them updated, but not maybe telling them everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think any opportunity you get to kind of keep them in the loop. So it's really helpful to, I say newsletter very loosely. What I've done more recently is kept a Notion page where, what I would do is outside of my regular board meetings, I would have like a monthly, high level update call with my investors. And I would just kind of summarize key learnings, key asks, what's going right, what's going wrong. And rather than it wasn't just about an update, but it was about engagement, right? How can I get help? How can I get some guidance or mentorship? And the more people you can have subscribing to that, just tracking your trajectory will be beneficial because maybe you can circle back for them later. On the flip side, I will say eliminating investors can often be just as valuable as keeping them in the loop, right? Because sometimes it's very hard to get a hard no. A lot of times you're going to get hey, this sounds really great, but you're a little bit early, or, come back at a later stage round. You have to be able to read between the lines and say, okay, this is a genuine interest or not. So I like the idea of reducing the funnel when I can, so I can repopulate it with new leads too. So I think you have to use a little bit of intuition and a little bit of discipline with your strategy.
If you've got 1 minute, are you okay to take Simon's question as the last one? Yeah, perfect. Simon.
Thanks, Betty. Hi, Gerrit. Yeah, thanks for an amazing talk there. My question is around your really good point around storytelling and the narrative and the hero's journey. Do you have any reference materials or something you can point us to? Obviously, I'm familiar with the concept, but usually it's quite a long-winded structure, and that's not really going to fit a pitch deck, to be honest. Do you have a sort of abbreviated, shorter version, either you can talk about or guide us to kind of pull something like that together?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to share if it's all right, Purdy. I can share with you a presentation that I do on kind of the science of pitching, and you're welcome to distribute it to everybody. The other reference I would say is two dear friends of mine published a book last year called Message Machine. It's by Oliver Aust and Jag Singh, who's former Techstars mentor or Techstars MD in Berlin. And they basically talk about communications, messaging, and storytelling from seed stage to growth, and in all of the different directions, whether it's investors, customers, broader market, recruitment, and how that evolves over time. So I found that to be a great resource. You might hear a little bit of my language in there. I am quoted in there a few times, so I did recycle a little bit of that. But they have engaged so many incredible founders and investors in different stages of the journey. So highly recommended book. You can get it on Amazon for pretty cheap.
Thank you so much.
So much for your time and for sharing that with everyone. So we could have stayed on for like hours and hours and hours. If people want to follow up with you, what is the best way for them to do so? LinkedIn?
Yeah, sure. LinkedIn/in/Gerrit McGowan, all one word. Feel free to connect. And like I said, I always tell people, if I'm not building ventures, my next favorite thing to do is help others build theirs. So if you want to just ask questions, or I'm happy to open up my network as best I can. So feel free to connect.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We will say goodbye to you, Gerrit. Everybody else stay on because we're going straight into the next session.
Thanks, Gerrit.
Stop recording. Thank you. See you soon.
See you guys. Thanks for having me.
Bye.